Hello, class. Let's continue now with Unit C, looking at Chapter 5, Section 3. Here we're going to look at the two-party system throughout history. So together you can follow along with that if you printed off the PowerPoint. We're going to see where they came from, what eras have they dominated, and so on. The first parties, as I mentioned earlier, were the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton, represented the wealthy, the upper class, and they wanted strong upper leadership and a more liberal interpretation of this Constitution, allowing the federal government more and more control even than what the Constitution explicitly gave them. On the other side, you had the Anti-Federalists, mostly led by Thomas Jefferson, who saw dangers in that view, and he more often represented the common man. There, he favored a Congress, or a government, where the Congress was the strongest arm, where the elected officials made all the decisions, and they held strictly to the powers that were given by the Constitution. Some of the relationships that we have with the civil government, you can see these in the biblical principle page that is part of the website. We must submit to the government, not unconditionally, of course, if those in power ask us to disobey God. We're also called to carry out prayer for those in authority over us, and that doesn't mean that as Christians we must be completely compliant and not involved. If there are issues or challenges or problems, we can appeal to the lesser magistrates. We can express displeasure with the government and try to invoke change legally. So that's also one biblical principle that John Calvin brings out. There are some eras. In the 18 to 1860, you had the Democrats dominating almost all the presidential elections leading up to the Civil War. Then, of course, the first of the modern Republican presidents elected was in 1860, Abraham Lincoln. And still today, one of the more beloved presidents, and again, the first major candidate for the modern Republican Party. So that's one thing. It was founded in 1854, and then that launched into the start of the Republican era, all the way through to the Great Depression, when Hoover misjudged the Great Depression, and the United States began a new era of the New Deal with the return of the Democrats by means of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal for the American people. So you see some of these major events that cause a shift in dominating one party over another in certain historical eras. Now we start into more of a mixed era, which we see here today. We have Nixon from 1968 and then forward to 76, and then switching over to Jimmy Carter from 76 to 80, and then 1980, Ronald Reagan was elected and served his 2 terms, and then his vice president, George H.W. Bush, served 1 term, then gave way to Bill Clinton in 1992, a Democrat. And they controlled then, for 2 terms, the Democrats controlled the White House until the election of George W. Bush in the year 2000. And then he went on to serve 2 terms on behalf of the Republicans. And then in 2008, Barack Obama was elected for 2 terms, 2 consecutive terms now, representing the Democrats. So you see in that whole era of the last several decades, a switching back and forth between Democrat and Republican holding of the White House. Other biblical principles noticed is that God does condemn proud and boastful governments and expects and holds accountable those who are in office.